All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking on anxiety disorders.
Always a popular topic.
It is, and anxiety is something that I think affects uh, so many people.
Pretty much everyone to some degree.
Yeah, yeah. So, we've got a really interesting resource to dig into today. You guys sent in Adrian Wells's Cognitive Therapy of Anxiety Disorders.
A classic.
Yeah, a hefty one, but we're going to try to get to the core of it today. And particularly, I'm interested in this idea of how our thoughts and beliefs can really fuel anxiety.
The crux of the matter, really.
Yeah. So how does cognitive therapy approach anxiety? What are some of the key techniques that are used? And we'll, try to keep it all nice and clear for you guys, no jargon, just straight to the point.
That's good.
So one of the things that really stood out to me right at the beginning of the book was this idea of maladaptive schemas.
Right.
And this is something that I think is really central to cognitive therapy.
Absolutely. It's a foundational concept.
So can you just break that down for us? What exactly are maladaptive schemas?
Sure. So you can think of schemas as these kind of deeply held beliefs, often about yourself or the world around you. And they're not necessarily bad in themselves. They can actually be quite helpful. They can help us make sense of things, make quick judgments, and navigate our lives.
Like shortcuts.
Yeah, exactly. But when these schemas become maladaptive, it means they're kind of rigid and inflexible. They don't really adapt to new information or changing circumstances, and they can lead to a lot of distress, particularly in the case of anxiety.
So they're not helpful anymore. They're kind of getting in the way.
Exactly. They're more like roadblocks than shortcuts at that point.
Got it.
And when we're talking about anxiety, these maladaptive schemas often revolve around, a sense of danger, a feeling that the world is a threatening place or that you're somehow vulnerable and not equipped to handle those threats.
Right.
And what's really interesting is that the book goes on to explain how these kind of core themes can then become even more specific depending on the particular type of anxiety disorder you might be dealing with.
Okay. So we've got these underlying schemas, these beliefs about danger and our ability to cope. And then it gets even more nuanced depending on, whether you're experiencing panic disorder or social anxiety or OCD, for example.
Precisely. Each disorder has its own sort of flavor, its own unique set of beliefs and interpretations that maintain the anxiety.
And that makes sense, right? Because anxiety isn't just one thing. It manifests in all these different ways.
Exactly.
So let's talk a bit more about the different kinds of thoughts that are involved in anxiety, because I think it's important to distinguish between, it's not just this one big jumble in our heads, is it?
No, not at all.
So the book makes a clear distinction between, things like negative automatic thoughts, worry, and obsessions.
Right.
So could you explain a little bit more about what those are and how they're different from each other?
Of course. So negative automatic thoughts, you can think of them as these kind of quick, almost knee-jerk negative thoughts that just pop into your mind. They often happen so fast you barely even notice them. But they can be really powerful in shaping how you feel and how you react in a given situation.
They're believable.
Yeah, very much so. They feel true in the moment.
Right, like I'm going to mess this up or everyone's judging me, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And then we have worry, which is a bit different.
Yeah.
Worry tends to be more of a kind of a chain of negative thoughts, often focused on trying to problem solve, trying to figure out a way to prevent something bad from happening.
Yeah.
And it's usually more verbal, like an internal monologue, going over and over, different scenarios in your head.
Yeah, like a broken record.
Yeah, exactly. And then we have obsessions.
Right.
And these are a bit different again. These are intrusive thoughts, images, or urges that just popped in your mind, unwanted, often really distressing, and they feel very much like they're not a part of you. What we call ego dystonic.
Yeah, like this thought is not me. Where did this come from?
Exactly. And they can be really frightening and disturbing because of that.
Yeah, because they feel so alien.
Yeah. And one of the things that the book emphasizes is that, while both negative automatic thoughts and worries are essentially your mind kind of evaluating what's going on around you or what might happen in the future, with obsessions, the obsession itself actually becomes the focus of the evaluation.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So instead of worrying about an upcoming presentation, you might be obsessing about the intrusive thought that you might do something inappropriate during the presentation.
Right. And that makes it so much harder to just let it go, right? Because it feels like it means something important about you.
Exactly. It becomes this huge, scary thing that you feel like you have to control or get rid of.
And it's also worth pointing out, I think, that the book makes it clear that worries and even obsessions are actually quite normal human experiences.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone worries to some extent, And most people will experience intrusive thoughts at some point in their lives.
Yeah, like that fleeting thought of, what if I just jumped in front of this train or something?
Right. Most people will have those kinds of thoughts from time to time, and it doesn't mean anything is wrong with them.
Yeah, so it's not the presence of worry or even obsessions that defines an anxiety disorder. It's more about the characteristics of those thoughts, how frequent they are, how intense they are, how much distress they cause, and how much they interfere with your life.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So, for example, typical worries tend to be more kind of drawn out and verbal, whereas typical obsessions are often briefer and more image-based, like a sudden flash in your mind. And what makes them problematic in anxiety disorders is when they become persistent, when they take on this kind of chronic quality, and when they're accompanied by a lot of distress and impairment.
Okay. So we've got this foundation of maladaptive schemas, these beliefs about danger and our ability to cope. And we've got these different types of thoughts that can feed into anxiety, negative automatic thoughts, worry, and obsessions. Now, let's bring this all together and talk about how this actually plays out in anxiety disorders.
That'd be good.
And the book presents a general cognitive theory of anxiety, and I think it really boils down to how you interpret the situations that you encounter.
Right.
So if you tend to appraise things in a negative way, that's going to lead to those negative automatic thoughts, misinterpretations, persistent worry, and that's going to directly impact how you feel emotionally and also how you behave.
Absolutely. Your appraisal of a situation is like the lens through which you see everything. And if that lens is distorted, it's going to color your entire experience.
Right. Yeah. So for example, if you're someone who tends to see the world as a dangerous place and you don't feel confident in your ability to cope, you might be more likely to avoid situations that make you anxious or to engage in behaviors that you believe are going to keep you safe.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Those are classic examples of what we call safety behaviors and avoidance. And they might provide some temporary relief from anxiety in the short term.
Right.
But the problem is, and this is really crucial to understand, is that in the long run, these behaviors can actually make the anxiety worse.
Oh, how so?
Well, for a couple of reasons. First, when you avoid a situation that makes you anxious, you never get the chance to learn that your fears are actually unfounded. So the fear just keeps growing in your mind.
It becomes this big, scary unknown.
Exactly. And second, when you engage in safety behaviors, you're essentially reinforcing the idea that the situation is dangerous.
Yeah.
You're telling your brain, see, I needed to do this to prevent something bad from happening, but because you never actually expose yourself to the situation without the safety behavior, you never learn that you could probably handle it just fine on your own.
So you're kind of trapping yourself in this cycle of anxiety.
Exactly. And it can be a really tough cycle to break out of. But that's where cognitive therapy comes in.
Yeah, because it gives you the tools to start to question those beliefs and those behaviors and to start testing them out in a safe and controlled way.
Absolutely. And it can be incredibly empowering to realize that you have more control over your anxiety than you might think.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork here. We've talked about maladaptive schemas, we've talked about different types of anxious thoughts, and we've talked about this general cognitive theory of anxiety. Now let's dig a little deeper and see how these principles actually play out in specific anxiety disorders.
Sounds good.
So the first one I want to talk about is panic disorder, because I think this is one that a lot of people can relate to. Even if you haven't experienced a full-blown panic attack, you've probably felt those sensations of, your heart racing, your breath getting shallow, feeling dizzy or lightheaded.
Yeah, those are really common physical symptoms of anxiety.
Right. And in panic disorder, these sensations become really terrifying, don't they?
They do. And that's because of the way they're interpreted.
Right.
So the cognitive model of panic disorder, and particularly David Clark's model from 1986, really emphasizes this crucial role of what we call catastrophic misinterpretation.
Right.
It's this idea that a relatively harmless physical sensation, like your heart racing after you've climbed a flight of stairs or you've had a cup of coffee, is misinterpreted as a sign of immediate and serious danger.
Like you're having a heart attack or you're about to faint.
Exactly. So for you, listening, this means that a normal bodily sensation that most people wouldn't even think twice about can trigger this whole cascade of fear and panic in someone with panic disorder.
And that misinterpretation sets off this whole chain reaction, this vicious circle of panic.
Exactly. So you have a trigger, which could be an internal sensation like dizziness, or it could be an external cue like being in a crowded place.
Right.
And that trigger is perceived as threatening. This leads to anxiety, which then produces more physical sensations. Your heart rate increases, you start to breathe more quickly, you might feel dizzy or lightheaded.
Right.
And those sensations are then misinterpreted as further evidence of danger. So you think, oh my God, this is really happening. I am having a heart attack. I'm about to faint. I'm going to lose control.
Right.
And that leads to even more anxiety, and the cycle just intensifies.
So it just spirals out of control.
Exactly. And one of the things that the book points out as kind of key factors that keep this panic cycle going are what we call safety behaviors and avoidance.
Okay. So safety behaviors are those things that you do to try to prevent the catastrophe that you're afraid of.
Right. So if you're afraid of fainting, you might sit down or hold on to something. If you're afraid of having a heart attack, you might avoid exercise or check your pulse constantly.
Right. And avoidance is pretty self-explanatory, right? You just avoid the situations that you fear might trigger a panic attack.
Exactly. So you might avoid crowded places, or you might avoid driving, or you might avoid being alone.
Right.
And while these behaviors might make you feel safer in the moment, the problem is that they actually prevent you from learning that your fears are unfounded.
Right. Because you never give yourself the opportunity to experience those situations without the safety behavior, so you never learn that you can actually handle them.
Exactly. And you also might mistakenly attribute the non-occurrence of the catastrophe to your safety behavior rather than to the fact that it probably wasn't going to happen anyway.
Right. Like if you avoid going to the mall because you're afraid of having a panic attack, and then you don't have a panic attack because you didn't go to the mall, you might think, well, see, that's because I stayed home. That's why I didn't have a panic attack. But in reality, you probably wouldn't have had a panic attack even if you had gone to the mall.
Exactly. And some safety behaviors can even make the physical symptoms worse, which then just reinforces the catastrophic misinterpretation and makes it seem even more believable.
Oh, that's interesting. How could a safety behavior actually make the symptoms worse?
Well, for example, if you're afraid of hyperventilating, you might start taking really shallow breaths to try to control your breathing.
Right.
But that can actually lead to you feeling even more lightheaded and dizzy, which then makes you think, see, I was right to be worried. I am hyperventilating.
Right. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
So how does cognitive therapy help to break this cycle?
Well, one of the first steps is often to help you become more aware of the cycle itself, to really understand how your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors are all interconnected and how they're contributing to the panic.
Right.
And the book mentions using panic diaries as a helpful tool for this. So you can start to track your panic attacks, identify what might have triggered them, what you were thinking and feeling in the lead up to the attack, and what you did during the attack.
Right.
And then once you have a better understanding of your own personal panic cycle, you can start to challenge those catastrophic misinterpretations and those safety behaviors.
Okay. And how do you do that?
Well, there are a number of different techniques that can be used.
Right.
One is what we call cognitive restructuring.
Right.
And this involves, really examining the evidence for your fears, looking for alternative explanations for your physical sensations, and developing more balanced and realistic thoughts.
So if you're feeling dizzy, instead of thinking, oh my God, I'm going to faint, you might think, well, maybe I'm just a little dehydrated. I need to drink some water.
Exactly. And the book also mentions using symptom induction experiments,
Right.
which can be really helpful for directly challenging those misinterpretations in a safe and controlled setting.
Okay. So explain that a little bit more. What is a symptom induction experiment?
Well, it involves intentionally trying to trigger the physical sensations that you fear most.
Right.
And then combining that with actions that demonstrate that your fears are unlikely to come true.
Okay. So for example, if you're afraid of hyperventilating, you might hyperventilate on purpose and then, I don't know, run around the block or something to show yourself that you're not actually going to pass out.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're afraid of having a heart attack, you might do some jumping jacks and then check your pulse to see that it's elevated, but it's not dangerous.
Right.
And the key here is to induce sensations that really closely resemble the panic symptoms that you fear most.
Right.
And then to combine that induction with what we call disconfirmatory maneuvers. So these are things that would be very difficult or impossible to do if your feared catastrophe was actually happening.
Right.
So for example, if you're afraid of choking, you might swallow some food and then try to talk or sing to show yourself that you're not actually choking.
Right.
And the book gives a really interesting example of someone who's afraid of going blind, and they would often experience this sensation of their vision kind of narrowing or getting tunnel vision.
Right.
And so the therapist had them stare at a bright light while they were intentionally hyperventilating.
Oh, wow.
And this helped them to realize that even when they were experiencing those visual disturbances, they were still able to see. And it's also really important to emphasize that these experiments are done in a very gradual and controlled way, and that the therapist will often demonstrate the procedure first to help you feel more comfortable and safe.
Right.
And they'll also work with you to make sure that you understand why you're doing the experiment and what you can expect to learn from it.
Okay, so that makes sense.
And then another important component of cognitive therapy for panic disorder is education.
Right.
So this involves giving you accurate information about panic symptoms, about what's actually happening in your body during a panic attack, and about the difference between anxiety and other medical conditions that you might be worried about.
Right. So helping you to understand that feeling of your heart racing doesn't necessarily mean you're having a heart attack, or that feeling dizzy doesn't necessarily mean you're going to faint.
Exactly. And the book mentions using things like tables that compare the evidence for and against your fears, or tables that contrast the symptoms of different conditions as helpful educational tools.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And then finally, just as with managing other forms of anxiety, developing a plan for preventing future relapses is really important for maintaining your progress.
Yeah.
So this might involve, identifying your early warning signs of anxiety, developing coping strategies that you can use when you start to feel anxious, and practicing those strategies regularly so that they become second nature.
Right. So you're kind of building up your arsenal of tools to deal with anxiety when it comes up.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about panic disorder. Let's move on to another common anxiety disorder, which is health anxiety.
Okay.
So this is sometimes called hypochondriasis, but the term that's more commonly used now is health anxiety.
Right.
And we talked earlier about the core beliefs that are involved in health anxiety, this fear of illness and death. But how does cognitive therapy specifically address these concerns?
Right. So one of the things that the book really stresses is that the main goal of cognitive therapy for health anxiety isn't to try to convince you that you're not sick.
Right.
It's about offering you a believable alternative explanation for your health worries.
Okay.
So a psychological explanation.
Yeah.
And therapy really focuses on building evidence for this alternative understanding and gradually shifting the focus away from the purely medical explanations that you might be, currently really attached to.
Okay.
So while directly addressing beliefs about specific illnesses is part of it, especially when you have, short-term catastrophic predictions about your health, like I'm going to have a heart attack right now, or this headache means I have a brain tumor. Often the experiments in therapy will actually focus on demonstrating the effects of things like paying too much attention to normal bodily sensations, or constantly seeking reassurance about your health, or excessively worrying about illness.
Right. So it's not just about challenging the belief that you have particular illness. It's more about challenging the way that you're thinking of your health in general.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the book mentions something called a nothing to lose approach as a way to initially engage people with health anxiety who might be, a bit skeptical about psychological treatment.
Right. Because if you're convinced that your problem is a physical one, you might not see the point in talking to a therapist.
Exactly. So the nothing to lose approach is basically about presenting cognitive therapy as another option to explore.
Right.
Particularly after, medical investigations haven't really provided lasting reassurance.
Right.
So the therapist might, gently point out that you've probably gone through multiple medical consultations and tests without finding a satisfactory answer, and suggest that trying a psychological approach could be, a worthwhile next step.
Sure.
And the idea is that even if it doesn't, completely eliminate your health concerns, you'll at least have, explored a different perspective, which might even make future medical interactions more productive if needed.
Right.
So it's framed as a situation where you have, little to lose and potentially a lot to gain.
Right. So it's not an either thing. It's not like you have to choose between seeing a doctor or seeing a therapist. You can do both.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are some specific techniques that are commonly used in cognitive therapy for health anxiety?
Right. So the book talks about reattribution strategies.
Okay.
And these are designed to help you to understand your physical symptoms in terms of your thoughts and behaviors that are that are related to those symptoms, rather than just, solely looking for medical explanations for each individual sensation.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure. So let's say you're someone who's really worried about having a heart attack, and you're constantly checking your pulse, and you notice that your heart is beating a little bit faster than usual.
Right.
A reattribution strategy might involve, exploring, well, how much have you been thinking about heart attacks lately? How anxious are you feeling in general? How much caffeine have you had today?
Right.
And could any of those factors be contributing to your increased heart rate?
Right.
Rather than assuming that it's, a sign of heart disease.
Right. So you're kind of shifting the focus from the symptom itself to the context in which the symptom is occurring.
Exactly. And behavioral experiments can also be really helpful for testing out those beliefs about your physical symptoms.
Right. Sure.
So the book gives the example of someone who's worried about leg weakness due to a serious illness, and they might be asked to vigorously use their leg muscles, like do some squats or lunges, to directly test their belief about their underlying physical weakness.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And reducing how often you seek reassurance about your health is another really key focus in therapy for health anxiety.
Yeah, right.
Because it's really natural to want to seek reassurance when you're worried about your health. But the problem is that repeatedly asking for reassurance can actually make your anxiety worse in the long run.
How so?
Well, it kind of feeds into that cycle of doubt and uncertainty. So every time you ask for reassurance and you get it, it's like you're getting a little hit of relief.
Right.
But that relief is usually very short-lived, and then the doubt creeps back in, and you have to ask for reassurance again.
Right, so it's like you're becoming addicted to the reassurance.
Exactly.
Oh.
And it can also prevent you from developing your own internal sense of confidence about your health.
Right, because you're always relying on someone else to tell you that you're okay.
Exactly. And then some other techniques that can be helpful in cognitive therapy for health anxiety include, keeping a record of your health-related thoughts, using pie charts to consider alternative explanations for your symptoms, using a technique called the inverted pyramid to challenge catastrophic thinking about illness.
Okay.
And therapy might also involve learning to answer those negative health-related thoughts in a more balanced and realistic way.
Right.
And using imagery techniques to manage distressing mental images about being ill. And the book even provides some examples of how to challenge really deeply held beliefs about death itself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to another common anxiety disorder, which is social anxiety.
Right.
So this is also sometimes called social phobia, but I think social anxiety is the more common term these days.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And we talked earlier about how the central fear in social anxiety is this fear of negative evaluation, this fear of being judged negatively by others. Right.
So how does cognitive therapy specifically target that fear?
Right. So cognitive therapy for social anxiety really focuses on closely examining the role of your self-focused attention and negative self-evaluation in keeping that anxiety going.
Okay.
So one of the key things that happens in social anxiety is that you become very self-conscious. You're constantly monitoring yourself, how you look, how you sound, what you're doing, what you're saying, and you're also assuming that other people are scrutinizing you in the same way.
Right.
And this kind of hyper-awareness of yourself leads to all sorts of physical symptoms of anxiety, like blushing, sweating, trembling, stammering. And then you start to worry that other people are noticing these symptoms and judging you negatively for them.
Right.
And so it becomes this really vicious cycle.
Right.
And the book emphasizes how safety behaviors, those things that you do to try to prevent social catastrophes, can actually unintentionally perpetuate the anxiety.
So for example, if you avoid making eye contact because you're worried about looking anxious, that behavior might actually make you appear less friendly or less confident to others, which could then inadvertently lead to the negative reaction that you were trying to avoid in the first place.
Right.
And then when nothing bad happens, you might mistakenly attribute that to your safety behavior, rather than recognizing that the feared outcome was probably unlikely anyway.
Right. Like if you rehearse what you're going to say in a conversation over and over again, and then the conversation goes well, you might think, well, see, that's because I rehearsed it. But in reality, the conversation probably would have gone just fine, even if you hadn't rehearsed it.
Exactly.
Okay. So how does cognitive therapy help you to challenge those beliefs and those behaviors?
Yeah. One of the first steps is often to really explore recent anxiety-provoking social situations that you've experienced, or even create similar situations in the therapy room to really understand the specific triggers, the physical symptoms, the thoughts and the behaviors that are involved.
Right.
And your therapist will likely ask you, really detailed questions about what symptoms you noticed, how obvious you thought those symptoms were to others, what you believed others were thinking about you.
Right.
And this really helps to uncover the content of your self-processing, that internal monologue and that negative image that you have of yourself in social situations.
Right. So you're kind of bringing those hidden thoughts and beliefs to the surface.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then once those thoughts and beliefs are out in the open, you can start to challenge them. You can start to look for evidence that supports them or contradicts them.
Right.
You can start to develop alternative, more balanced and realistic thoughts.
Yeah.
And you can start to experiment with different behaviors to see what happens. And behavioral experiments in social situations are really important in cognitive therapy for social anxiety. And the book specifically highlights the use of video feedback.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So this can be a really powerful way to challenge those negative self-perceptions.
Right.
By providing a more objective view of how you actually appear to others in social interactions.
Okay.
So you might, record yourself giving a presentation or having a conversation and then watch the recording back with your therapist.
Right.
And you might be surprised to see that you don't look or sound as anxious as you thought you did.
Right.
Or that other people are actually responding to you in a more positive way than you had anticipated.
Right. Because often we're our own worst critics, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And then based on that more accurate feedback, you can start to develop more rational self-statements to challenge your negative appraisals and manage your attention in social situations.
Okay, so give me an example of a rational self-statement.
Sure. So let's say you're at a party and you're feeling really anxious and you start to think, everyone's staring at me. They think I'm weird.
Right.
A rational self-statement might be, well, most people at parties are focused on their own conversations and their own experiences.
Right.
They're probably not paying that much attention to me.
Right.
Or even if some people are noticing me, that doesn't mean they're judging me negatively. They might just be curious or friendly.
Right.
And these kind of self-statements can help to kind of shift your attention away from that internal self-focus and back out to the external world.
Right. So you're kind of talking yourself down from that ledge of anxiety.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to another common anxiety disorder, which is generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD.
Oh.
And the main characteristic here is persistent and excessive worry.
Right. Worry about pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Work, money, relationships, health, the future, the past, you name it.
Yeah. So how does cognitive therapy approach this kind of ongoing state of anxiety?
Right. Well, one of the key things that cognitive models of GAD emphasizes is how you think about worry itself.
Oh,
What's often called meta-worry.
meta-worry.
Yeah. So it's not just about the things that you're worrying about in the external world. It's also about your worries about worrying.
Oh, okay.
So you're worried that you worry too much, your worry is out of control, you're worried that your worry is going to lead to bad things happening, like you're going to have a mental breakdown or something.
Oh, right. So it's like worry squared.
Exactly. And the book actually distinguishes between what it calls type 1 worries, which are about external events like finances or work or relationships,
Right.
and type 2 worries, which are about the worry process.